So welcome back to Module 14, Behavior Genetics, Predicting Individual Differences. This is a really interesting module, and really a lot of the stuff that we'll learn about is on the cutting edge of much research that is going on within the field of behavioral genetics. What is behavioral genetics? Sort of studying the interplay between heredity and environment. So everywhere, as a parent, I can tell you that parents wonder, how are our kids going to be aggressive? Are they going to be passive? Are they going to be extroverted or introverted? How will I know? Can I do anything about it? What comes built in? What is nurtured and how? So a lot of the research in this field is really helping to explain some of these things, and some of it is rather surprising. The learning targets for this module are to be able to define chromosomes, DNA, genes, and the human genome. Sounds complicated, but it's really about understanding what the basics are and describe how behavior geneticists explain our individual differences. Also know a little bit about twin and adoption studies, fascinating topics, and many wonderful videos that you can watch about the gym twins and identical strangers, and lots of other ones like on YouTube about some of the amazing similarities between identical twins separated at birth. So we want to be able to explain how the studies help us understand the effects and interaction of nature and nurture, and explain by what is meant by the term heritability and how it relates to individuals versus groups, and describe a little bit about how molecular genetics research is changing our understanding of the effects of nature and nurture. So how does heredity differ from environment? So we hear over and over again within psychology and outside of psychology, the terms nature and nurture. Heredity is really talking about nature, the genetic transfer of characteristics from parent to offspring. Whereas nurture is anything environmental that isn't related to our genetics. So every non-genetic influence. And what's really important to remember, and I think sometimes we forget this, is that includes prenatal things. So things that happen in the womb are environmental, even though they're happening, before the baby's born. They are considered environmental influences. So what do behavior geneticists study? Well, behavioral geneticists study the relative power and limits of heredity and environmental influences on behavior. And a really famous I call it behavioral geneticist rather than behavior geneticist, as is termed in these slides usually. A really famous behavioral geneticist, Robert Plomin, is out of King's College in London, I believe. And if you end up being really interested in this topic, I highly recommend his book, Blueprint. It's a really, really interesting read on behavioral genetics and sort of where the research is and where it's going. So the nurture of nature, what comes built in? Like when we're born, what is written into our genetics and what is nurtured and how? First off, we want to start with an understanding of what a chromosome is. So we should be thinking about, like, in terms of all of this, the plans for your own sort of book of life are run by 46 chapters. 23 of those chapters come from your mother's egg, and 23 come from your father's sperm. Okay. Each of these chapters is called a chromosome, and is composed of a coiled chain of the molecule deoxyribonucleic acid, which is also known more commonly as DNA. So chromosomes are the thread-like structures made of DNA molecules that contain our genes. Again, to review, each person has 46 chromosomes, unless there's some sort of disorder. You will inherit 23 from your mother and 23 from your father. So what is deoxyribonucleic acid? It's a complex molecule containing the genetic information that makes up chromosomes. And it was found to have a shape of a double helix, as you'll see right there. And most often we hear about Watson and Crick, who apparently discovered this, but I think I just actually watched a TED Ed yesterday that was pointed out that maybe there was another researcher, and I'm blanking on her name, that actually, this TED Ed about it, you can look it up, that actually says that this other woman, and I'm thinking her last name was Franklin, was the one who actually found the initial structure of DNA. But so that's an interesting fun fact to go look up, because we always hear about Watson and Crick. Okay, what are genes? Genes, so the nucleus of every human cell contains chromosomes, each of which is made of 2 strands of DNA connected in that double helix shape, which is really cool to look at. Just love looking at the shape of DNA. Genes are DNA segments that are turned on when they're expressed. They direct the development of proteins that influence a person's individual development. So they're the biochemical units of heredity that make up chromosomes. Excuse me. They're segments of DNA capable of synthesizing proteins. And you have approximately 20,000 genes, which is a bit surprising because geneticists actually thought we were going to end up having a lot more than that. But we have about 20,000. What is the human genome? You may have heard about the Human Genome Project. And it's the complete instructions for making a human organism consisting of all the genetic material in that human's chromosomes. Researchers have discovered, lots of research and lots of funding went into the Human Genome Project. Researchers have discovered a common sequence within human DNA. This shared genetic profile is what makes us humans rather than tulips, bananas, or chimpanzees. And it's amazing how much similarity in our most of our genetics we have with things like bananas. So genetically speaking, every other human is kind of really close to us genetically. Researchers that study the human genome have discovered a common sequence within human DNA, and this is what makes us humans rather than those tulips, bananas, or chimpanzees. But what's funny is that we share about half of our genes with a banana. At a genetic level, humans and chimpanzees are about 96% identical, which is crazy to think about. At functionally important DNA sites, this number is actually even higher, like 99.4%. Yet that 0.6% is really matters a lot. Small differences also matter among other species. If you've ever had the luxury, the privilege of seeing a bonobo chimpanzee versus a regular common chimpanzee, that's a good example to see how tiny differences in genetics can have huge effects. Bonobos and chimpanzees resemble each other a lot, and their genetics differ by much less than 1%, but they have markedly different behaviors, with chimpanzees being aggressive and male-dominated and bonobos being peaceful, and they're more likely to be female-led. I was lucky to see bonobos at the San Diego Zoo, probably like 15 to 20 years ago, and it was fascinating to just look into their eyes, and they just felt so very human-like. Okay, how do monozygotic twins develop? So what are monozygotic twins? They're identical twins. Maybe some of you listening to this are an identical twin. And they fascinate researchers, especially psychologists, and they're studied often. So what are they though? Well, a single fertilized egg that splits in 2, creating 2 genetically identical organisms. So identical twins come from a single fertilized egg that splits in 2. As opposed to dizygotic twins, which are also known more commonly as fraternal twins, they are separate fertilized eggs that share a maternal prenatal environment. Okay, so they're 2 different eggs, but they share the same prenatal environment. And they are no more alike genetically than regular siblings. And that's why you can have male-female fraternal twins, but not identical twins. So how do monozygotic, identical, and dizygotic fraternal twin studies help us understand nature and nurture? So a person whose identical twin has, autism spectrum disorder has about a 3 in 4 risk of being similarly diagnosed. So there's a pretty strong genetic underpinning there. The effect, based on looking at both monozygotic and dizygotic twins. If the affected twin is a dizygotic twin, the co-twin only has a 1 in 3 risk, so it's definitely less. Identical twins are much more alike on some of the personality characteristics of the big 5 inventory, such as extroversion, which is outgoingness, and neuroticism, which is emotional instability. So there seems to be a pretty strong genetic link to some of those underlying personality characteristics, which is really fascinating because a lot of us are like, what? Our personalities have a genetic link, and it appears so. So drinking and driving convictions are 12 times greater among those who have an identical twin than those with a fraternal twin with such a conviction. Again, there's some underlying behavioral things going on that seem to have really strong genetic links. So what do twins reared apart tell us about heredity and environment? This research is just so fascinating. Thomas Bouchard and his colleagues located and studied 74 pairs of identical twins reared apart. They found so many similarities between things like taste and physical attributes, personality, abilities, attitudes, interests, and even fears. One of the most famous studied twin group that was raised apart is the Jim twins. And if you've never seen it before, I highly recommend finding it on YouTube, finding the Jim twins study and seeing how these 2 men who were raised apart came back together, I think at about age 39, and the truly unbelievable similarities that they had. If you're really interested in the Bouchard study as well, you can read about it or get the actual study, but you can read about it within the 40 Studies That Change Psychology book I've mentioned in previous recordings. And there's a section called Are You a Natural? And it sort of summarizes the Thomas Bouchard study. How do adoption studies help us understand nature and nurture? The stunning finding from studies of hundreds of adoptive families is that, apart from identical twins, people who grow up together, whether biologically related or not, do not much resemble one another in personality. Take some time to think about that. Think about with your own family as well. Lots and lots of research is showing that especially long-term, that how we're raised has very little effect on what the development of our personality and on other psychological characteristics as well. And actually, as we get older, we almost become more of who we are because there's a little bit more of an influence on things, especially like intelligence earlier on when we're children. But as we move away from our parental unit and stuff, we become more of who we are, and there's less of a link to any sort of environmental influence. So 2 adopted children raised in the same home are no more likely to share personality traits with each other than with the child down the block. I can affirm this anecdotally, which I shouldn't do, but within our own family, our 2 children have very, very unbelievably different personality traits. The environment shared by a family's children has virtually no discernible impact on their personalities. So let's stop and think about identical twins reared apart. So those monozygotic twins that for whatever reason are reared in separate homes. Do the findings from these studies support the nature or nurture model of development? Well, there's a lot of information that supports more of a nature model of development, and underlying genetic influences on who we become seem to be quite important. Adopted children, do the findings from these studies support the nature and nurture model? Again, a lot of the information showing us that there isn't a lot of effect of the environment on things like our personality that we end up with, which is fascinating to really think about. So the term heritability, what is it? The proportion of variation among individuals in a group that we can attribute to genes. The heritability of a trait may vary depending on the range of populations and environments studied. So how do behavior geneticists estimate the heritability of a trait? So many personality traits are about 40% heritable, they're finding. This is through twin studies, adoption studies, and more recently, these genome-wide association studies that are happening. We're learning more about really looking directly at the genetics and seeing how much is heritable. Intelligence is about 60% heritable. and height is about 90% heritable. So you can see, while we know there's a lot of genetic influence on many things, and on many things we never really realized in the past, there's still a big part of left unaccounted for that does seem to be related to environmental issues. So what does intelligence is about 60% heritable mean and not mean? So what it means, genetic influence explains about 66% of the observed variation among people. So we're talking about groups. We're not talking about you individually when we're using these heritability estimates. This is a discussion about different groups, not about you individually. So what it doesn't mean is that your intelligence is about 66% genetic, no matter what you want to tell your parents. Okay. Teasing apart environment. Consider Mark Twain's fictional idea of raising boys in barrels, a little creepy, to age 12 and feeding them from a hole. If we were to follow his suggestion, the boys would all emerge with lower than normal intelligence scores at age 12. Why? The title of my science project is My Little Brother. Haha. Let's not do any science projects like that. Okay. Yet, given their equal environments, their test score differences could be explained only by heredity. Why? Well, if they had exactly the same environment, which basically is impossible to do ethically, putting them in barrels would not be very ethical, it's really hard to completely control the environment. But if we could completely control the environment, then the differences that we saw would be 100% due to heredity. So what would you answer? Generally speaking, heritability is the extent to which, A, differences among people are accounted for by genes. Okay. How do similar environments impact heritability? If all schools were of uniform quality, sort of like if all kids were raised in a barrel, all families equally loving, and all neighborhoods equally healthy, then heritability would increase. So we'd be able to see there's more genetic influence because differences due to environment would decrease, okay? Because you wouldn't have any differences across the environment. You would only have the differences that were due to genetics. So any difference we notice between two students would be due more to their genes than to their environment. If every single school, every single family, every single neighborhood was exactly the same, sounds really creepy, then we would be able to say that the differences were not due to the environment, they were due to genetics. So what's the difference between the term molecular genetics and molecular behavior genetics? So molecular genetics is the study of the molecular structure and function of the genes. Behavioral genetics is the further study of how the structure and function of the genes interact with our environment to influence our behavior. That is what we're really interested in within psychology, right? We are interested in a little bit more than just understanding the molecular structure and the function of the genes. We want to know, how are those genes interacting with our environment to influence our behavior, our personalities, our intelligence, all these psychological characteristics. Okay, epigenetics. Totally fascinating area of study. I know they say that all the time. I love psychology. Epigenetics, the study of environmental influences on gene expression that occur without a DNA change. So this is some crazy stuff to think about, especially as a teenager. In what way, this is basically telling us in what way that the choices that we're making, these environmental influences, can actually turn on and off our genetics. Okay, so doing things, our lifestyle choices can have an effect on whether or not we express certain genes. When we break down the word epigenetics, the epi means just above or in addition to. So epigenetics is studying how an individual's lifestyle, environment, choices, etc., can directly interact with the genome. And this is really important stuff for all of us to understand. That while many things are kind of written in our genes, which makes people think, oh, I can't change it, it's genetic, that's just the way my family is, right? That isn't true, right? We certainly can change our genetics. We can certainly turn on and off switches within our genetics. Maybe not change our genetics, but we can turn things on and off by the choices that we make within our lives. So how does epigenetics influence gene expression? Beginning in the womb, life experiences lay down epigenetic marks, okay? They're often these things called organic methyl molecules that can affect the expression, how genes express themselves in any segment of DNA, Okay, so you can see things that can have an effect and switch on and off these genes. And this stuff is so fascinating. There was a PBS special several years ago called "The Ghost in My Genes," I believe. It's fascinating to look into if you're interested in this topic. So prenatally, things like drugs, toxins, nutrition, stress can have a big effect, turning on or off those switches. Neglect, abuse, variations in care, environmental complexity, those kind of things can have an effect. Cognitive challenges, exercise, nutrition, what we're putting into our body, what we're eating, what we're drinking can have an effect in our gene expression. So what are some examples of epigenetics in research? Researchers have found the effects of childhood trauma, poverty, or malnutrition may last a lifetime. Conceivably, your health and well-being could be affected by stresses, pollutants that your parents or even your grandparents experienced. So a lot of the things that we're seeing that we never saw before, occurring more often, in terms of our, behavioral manifestations of different disorders, it could be things that our grandparents were exposed to, and or stresses that they experienced. I think about things like the Great Depression or lack of food, or I have grandparents that grew up in great poverty, and how did the experiences they had, how was that written into what genes within me get turned on and off? So researchers question why only one member of an identical twin pair may develop a genetically influenced disorder. That can happen, like one pair of identical twin group could just develop schizophrenia, and epigenetics is kind of helping them understand that a little bit. So what would you answer? Epigenetics might best explain which of the following? So that would be C. Lisa and Eloisa are identical twins, which, remember, share exactly the same genetics, but only one develops schizophrenia, which we know schizophrenia is a disorder that has a high heritability rate. Excuse me. So learning target review. First one, define chromosomes, DNA, genes, and the human genome, and describe how behavioral geneticists explain our individual differences. Genes. They are the biochemical units of heredity that make up chromosomes, which are the thread-like coils of DNA. Drawing it out. I think drawing this out is really helpful to help you understand a little bit what genes, chromosomes versus DNA, to keep them straight in your mind. Behavioral geneticists seek to quantify genetic and environmental influences on our traits. Most of our differing traits are influenced not by one gene, but by many. And this is an area I didn't really mention too much, but within behavioral genetics, the study directly of our genetics is finding that it isn't just one trait, it can be determined by one gene. It's small little differences. They're called technically single nucleotide polymorphisms within thousands and thousands of genes, which are sort of being shown to be related to differences in our personalities, our preferences, and what disorders we may manifest. So learning target 14.2, explain how twin and adoption studies help us understand the effects and interactions of nature and nurture. Studies of identical monozygotic twins, fraternal dizygotic twins, and adoptive families allow researchers to consider the effects of shared environment and shared genes, which sheds light on how nature and nurture influence our traits. And what's absolutely fascinating, what you need to remember about this, is that shared family environments have little effect on personality, and the stability of personality suggests a genetic predisposition. And I can see that from an anecdotal personal perspective as well. I'm always on the big 5 personality characteristics. I always, since I was, first time I took it in undergrad, I've always been high on the openness to experience. I'm also fairly introverted and have low, what else do I have? Low neuroticism. I'm trying to remember the canoe. I'm pretty high on the conscientiousness. And probably kind of low on the agreeableness sometimes. I have a lot of opinions. Okay, explain what is meant by heritability and discuss how it relates to individuals and groups. So heritability describes the extent to which variation among members of a group can be attributed to genes. Heritable individual differences in traits such as height or intelligence don't imply heritable group differences. Genes mostly explain why some people are taller than others, but not why people are taller today than they were a century ago, right? So there's obviously environmental influence because people are getting taller overall, even though they're passing on the same, genes from parent to child and so on. Okay, describe how molecular genetics research is changing our understanding of the effects of nature and nurture. Our genetic predispositions and our surrounding environment interact. Think about this all as an interaction of who we are, our genetics, and what environment we have around us. And what's really fascinating is to think about the nature of nurture and how who we are genetically sort of creates what our environment will be, because we kind of create our own environment based on our underlying genetics. If I'm rather introverted, I'm not going to go out and make my environment be something where I'm exposed to lots of people all the time in an overly chaotic sort of world, right? I'm going to create a world where I'm able to have the time by myself. Environments can trigger gene activity, and genetically influenced traits can evoke responses from others. Molecular geneticists study the molecular structure and function of genes, including those that affect behavior. The field of epigenetics studies the influences on gene expression that occur without changes in DNA. So remember that epigenetics is sort of that over and above genetics with how our environmental influences, the choices that we're making to some extent, like nutrition and that sort of thing, but also things that we're exposed to through no fault of our own, right? If we're exposed to any sort of trauma or abuse or anything like that, that can switch on or off some of our genes, and then that can later on be passed on to our kids and grandkids and so on. Fascinating, fascinating stuff. Well, we are at the end of our module, so thank you for listening. Take care.